Hello and welcome to episode 169. It is the 14th of December 2021, which means 30 years ago, right now, I was watching the Wonder Stuff at the now demolished Granby Halls in Leicester. They're a band that I love. I've loved them for as long as I've known about them. I'll probably love them for at least the next 30 years. Today I'm going to be talking about David Bowie's ninth studio album, released on the 7th of March 1975. The album is Young Americans. It's very definitely a product of its time because Bowie is smoking a fag on the front. Don't smoke, kids. It is bad for you, apparently. And in New Zealand, they are raising the age of the people that can smoke cigarettes by 1 year every year. So eventually, there's going to be 60-year-olds hanging around outside newsagents asking 80-year-olds to buy them a pack of Gaspers. There you are. I didn't think they ever thought it'd be quite like that. Some things never change but the shoes, as Doctor and the Medics sang. Young Americans is, I think, a great album with perhaps, let's just pretend that it doesn't have Bowie smoking a fag on the front, and then it looks a lot better. It's a great album that has aged very, very well. It's the first time where I think he really stepped into himself. Now, a lot of people will think, oh, but the albums that he made before, Ziggy Stardust, Diamond Dogs, maybe not Pin-Ups, are fantastic albums, and they're very, very good, really good, but I really love the stuff when he gets into Young Americans. From here on in, he doesn't do many duds at all. In fact, there's only 2 bad albums in the rest of David Bowie's career. I will leave you to guess which ones they are, but they are not Outside or Earthling, by the way, although I know those are very divisive albums. So Young Americans has a convoluted history. It had a number of iterations before it came out. It wasn't toured. There was a huge amount of studio activity that happened in the run-up to the album, and not very much outside. To really understand, I think, where Young Americans comes from, you first have to be aware of a record by Ava Cherry and the Astronettes, which was released on CD here in 2009 as the Astronettes Sessions. And the Astronettes Sessions were recorded in early 1974 for 3 or 4 days. David Bowie and his band at that point, with Ava Cherry, one of his backing vocalists, on lead vocals. And there's a number of David Bowie original songs that have not actually been released anywhere else apart from on this record. This record was abandoned during recording. I think maybe Bowie thought that it wasn't as strong a record as perhaps it could have been, and maybe it never really gelled, perhaps. Some of the songs just aren't great. Really, they are really good B-sides as opposed to really good album tracks. So if you're sat there going, I really want to hear some David Bowie songs that I've not heard before, please do buy this, but please be aware that you are getting Division 2 David Bowie material from 1974. So there's 4 songs on here which are Bowie originals. They are I Am a Laser, Having a Good Time, People from Bad Homes, Only Me, Things to Do, and I Am Divine. So that's 6 David Bowie originals on there, plus a number of cover versions, including a cover version of the Beach Boys' well-known God Only Knows, which David would later revisit and re-record in 1984 for the absolutely abominable Tonight album. Oh, I'm looking forward to talking about Tonight, although someone may have to call up Law and Order because there will have been a murder at that point, and it wasn't just murder on my ears. So the 6 originals that are on this album are fairly slight, I'll be honest. I Am a Laser was recorded by David as well with his vocals, and it later became Scream Like a Baby on the Scary Monsters album. The other songs, I Am Divine, became rewritten and later appeared in a different form, and there's also a circulating vocal take of I'm Divine by David Bowie. So if you want to hear kind of like the missing link between Ziggy Stardust and Diamond Dogs and Young Americans, it's on here. Just be aware that Ava Cherry is not as good a singer as David Bowie. That's a very nice way of putting it indeed. And this is a curiosity, really. Ideally, in a perfect world, someone would put David Bowie vocals over this because it's very clearly members from David Bowie's band. I think Mike Garson plays on it. You can really hear, I think you can hear Tony Visconti talking. You can hear, David Bowie talking as well. You can hear a number of other musicians that very clearly sound exactly like his backing band at the time on this. And this band kind of then went in and went on the road and started performing and touring the Young Americans, not the Young Americans, the Diamond Dogs album. Sorry. What a catastrophic screw up to make only 5 minutes in. Still, there are only about 29 David Bowie albums. Occasionally you will get confused into which order they come in. So, Ava Cherry and the Astronettes. If you're absolutely gasping for some classic mid-70s Bowie that you haven't heard, this isn't it. If you're happy to take some should-have-been B-sides with somebody else singing that David Bowie wrote, this is worth getting, about £3, by the way, on Amazon, plus postage. And that's probably about as much as I think anyone should be prepared to pay for it. When David was touring the Diamond Dogs album, he released the David Live album, and then later, after his death, he released 2 further live albums that had been prepared posthumously. They are, and I have mentioned these before, Cracked Actor and Bowie the Soul Tour. These feature songs from the Young Americans album before they'd been recorded and released for Young Americans. So the closest thing you got to a Young Americans tour was Young Americans played live before it came out. Some of these songs were never played again. In fact, one of them, I think Win, was only played once live, possibly twice. So for example, Cracked Actor features John I'm Only Dancing again, but I'm not sure it features anything else that's meant to be on the Young Americans album, although the band were rehearsing the songs in sound checks. And then John I'm Only Dancing, the Soul Tour, which was the Record Store Day release, I think from 2020, does feature live versions of Can You Hear Me, It's Gonna Be Me, and Somebody Up There Likes Me, as well as a cover version of Foot Stomping, which Foot Stomping is probably the song that's the first sign of greatness here. So Carlos Alomar, I think, plays guitar on this album, had a riff when they were doing Foot Stomping live, which then later turned into, I think it turned into Fame, actually. So Nothing Good is ever lost. And so they thought about recording Foot Stomping in the studio for the Young Americans album, but they turned the riff from that and they turned it into the track Fame. So Young Americans, the album, comes in 2 forms. Only one of which is locked inside this staggeringly expensive box set, Who Can I Be Now? And Who Can I Be Now, as I've mentioned before, features Bowie's output between 74 and 76, features a couple of live albums, 4 studio albums, and recall to a selection of B-sides and singles edits that's perhaps a little slimmer than some of the other releases. But there are 2 versions of Young Americans that are presented on Who Can I Be Now. There is the tried and tested Young Americans album. There is also the legendary and barely rumoured Gouster album, which is the first configuration of Young Americans that was completed a couple of months sooner, and then David went back into the studio. So Young Americans was recorded in a form as the Gouster, starting on the 8th of August 1974 with David Bowie's touring band during a break in recording sessions. And this had the effect of having a nice tight live band that really gelled in the studio, and with songs that they'd worked up through sound checks and been taught by David, as well as I think some prototype versions of them recorded during the Ava Cherry session. So I'm Divine, I think, was later released under a different name, or recorded under a different name with a slightly different configuration of the lyrics. Starting at Sigma Studios in August 1974, the first change that we had for this album was a change in recording styles. So when David was recording in London, the engineers were applying effects such as phasers, vocals, choruses, flanges, echoes, those type of things during the recording sessions, straight when Bowie was singing into the mic. So he'd not heard his voice naked without effects when he was recording. In America, these effects were added later when the tape was played back, which meant that it sounds a little bit different, the vocals on this album, to the albums that came before it, because they were being recorded in a different way. But it also chronicles those songs being played live in front of you by the band playing together as a live performance in the studio, as opposed to perhaps being constructed like Lego building blocks over a series of several months. The first thing that I will say is on the Soul Tour, obviously documented on the live albums, Cracked Actor and John I'm Only Dancing, a number of songs were played live from this album and these sessions. They were played live, and I think this was recorded in October 1974. So this was recorded after the sessions for the Gouster and Young Americans had already taken place. So the definitive studio versions of the songs already existed. They just hadn't been released yet. These days, if you want to release an album, it takes 35 weeks after you've agreed to have the vinyl kind of made and sent off the details before the album is pressed, whereas then you could do it in a matter of weeks. So the album was finished recording in January 1975 and was out in early March 1975. In this case, most of Young Americans had been recorded in October, August and September. The tour had been starting in, went through October, November, maybe December, possibly, I'm not quite sure. I was only 18 months old at the time, and so some of those songs were played live. So Young Americans had been played live, I think. Can You Hear Me? It's Gonna Be Me. Somebody Up There Likes Me. Foot Stomping, which became Fame. They'd all been played live, I think. And then I think this one here, I think it might feature Can You Hear Me? Let's just check. No, it doesn't. Sorry, totally wrong again. But there you are. And so with the Gouster, as the album was originally meant to be, it wasn't quite finished. There were a lot of songs that were recorded for the Gouster that were slowly over time jettisoned as the album became Young Americans. And there were some extra sessions that took place at the record plant in New York in December 74 and finished on 12th of January 1975, where additional tracks were recorded, and those include, I think, Fame and a cover version of the Beatles' Across the Universe. Both of those two songs featured John Lennon. I think maybe Bowie recorded Across the Universe in order to get John Lennon to play on it. The version of Across the Universe on Young Americans isn't very good. It's also not the first, or more correctly, not the last cover of John Lennon, because later on in the dreaded years of Tin Machine did cover Working Class Hero, which I think is a John Lennon track as well. So this album, the first version of it that exists is the Gouster, which was released in Who Can I Be Now, which came out in 2016. And the Gouster here is an album that never existed during David Bowie's lifetime. It had always come very close to existing, but had later been relegated, redesigned and rethought. And so this version of it here contains a sort of an inner sleeve. The version I've got contains what looks to be a fan club package, but obviously isn't, and shrunk down to size, and it also features a CD with the album. And the version of the Gouster that's on here is almost the album, but it isn't quite the album. So the track listing does differ. It starts with John, I'm Only Dancing again, which was re-recorded in 1975, but not heard by anybody until 1979. And the re-recorded version of John, I'm Only Dancing features a different vocal, features different lyrics, a different verse structure. It really only keeps the chorus from the original 1972 single. It features Somebody Up There Likes Me, which appeared as an alternate mix on Young Americans. It features It's Gonna Be Me, which did get a release in 1991 on the Rykodisc version of the album. Yes, I know there's a sticker from the 1999 reissues there. It features Who Can I Be Now, which was also released on the Rykodisc version of Young Americans in 1991. It features an alternate mix of Can You Hear Me, the album version of Young Americans, and an alternate mix of Right. So it's like a 95% complete David Bowie album. That said, there are 4 songs that are on the Gouster that do appear on Young Americans, and it is quite frustrating knowing that there are also some more songs which could have been on the Gouster and made it actually a separate entity in its own right. The other thing that I think they didn't get quite right actually with the Gouster, and it's this album feels like a recreation of an album that never was. So therefore it's box set bait designed to get you to buy the box set. The other thing about the Gouster is the mix of Young Americans is exactly the same as the version that's on the album. So you get the same mix, the same performance twice on 2 different discs here in the box set. In fact, if you include the singles edit that's on the Recall disc, you get 3 versions of the same recording of the song, 2 of which are exactly identical. There are some great extended mixes which fans have put together of Young Americans that drag the song out or explore its full potential. I'm a sucker for a good old-fashioned 12-inch mix that really explores the full potential of each song and allows each part of the song to grow and turns Young Americans into an epic length. Were I in charge of this, obviously I'm not, I would have put the extended mix of the Gouster, which is a fan of Young Americans, on the Gouster, which is of course a fan version, a fan mix. But if it's on YouTube, I will link to it down there in a couple of minutes when I finish talking about this. So the Gouster feels like it isn't the album that it needed to be. What David needed to do with this, and what he did do eventually with Young Americans, was sever his ties completely with the glam rock scene that I think he'd been very tightly kind of allied to, whether he liked it or not. All scenes have a finite lifespan. They don't last forever. They die eventually in time. And if you don't move and evolve beyond that, the risk is you always become trapped forever, like a fly in amber or a mosquito in Jurassic Park that never evolves, never changes, and is stuck forever in a corner of a foreign field where it's somewhere, always the summer of 1973, which I don't remember at all. And so what Young Americans did is effectively it broke the link between David Bowie as glam rock star, Ziggy Stardust and so on, and portrayed him as almost a kind of like modern day British soul singer, part Frank Sinatra, part kind of funk god, part Stevie Wonder, which I think was a fantastic thing for him to do. And it really means that the album now feels like it could have been recorded yesterday. It sounds fresh and new, whereas perhaps albums like Ziggy Stardust don't sound or feel quite so fresh. Those albums sound very much like they were recorded on a particular day in 1971 or 1972. Young American sounds like it could have been recorded yesterday. It has a fantastic sound that has not aged. And that is why I think Young Americans is one of his best albums. So we have 8 tracks on Young Americans. Let's quickly go through the songs that we've got on there, talk a little bit about the genealogy of them, and then we'll go through the extra songs. So the album opens with Young Americans, which was recorded at Sigma Sound and mixed in London. This album, by the way, has the first appearances by Carlos Alomar, who played with David until 1995 on the Outside Tour, and also the first recorded appearance of Dennis Davis, who played drums on every studio album by David up to Scary Monsters in 1980. So this is the start of a sound of the coalescing of a sound that would come to define him for half a decade. You think about the songs that those guys played on those albums, Heroes, Low, Lodger, Scary Monsters. Carlos played on some of the other later material as well. That's classic stuff. If you think, well, what great songs are, what are one of my favourite David Bowie songs? Some of those will definitely have these musicians on there. And the other people that are in the band, by the way, include Earl Slick, making his first appearance on record, although apparently he did some overdubs on the Ziggy Stardust motion picture live soundtrack. Earl played with David right up until the end of his career. I think the last record that Earl played on was The Next Day, which was released in 2013. And there's also vocals by Ava Cherry, and Luther Vandross appears on this as well, I think. And Luther also co-wrote one of the songs on the album. I think it is called... I don't know. I think it's Fascination, which is adapted from a Luther Vandross demo called Funky Music. But no, it's a Young Americans is a great album. It opens with the title track, and the title track, by the way, Young Americans, is kind of like a character sketch. So it's influenced a bit by Springsteen and the stuff that he was doing. There's also a cover of Springsteen's "It's Hard to Be a Saint in the City" that was recorded during the Young American sessions and also revisited during the Station to Station sessions. And songs like Young Americans and the Springsteen songs are also huge influences on those kind of sketches of working class life that you hear in Bon Jovi's "Living on a Prayer." Johnny used to work down the docks, and then also through to things like Blur's character sketches from the Modern Life is Rubbish album. So the influence of Young Americans stretches through to today. The world would be a very different place without Young Americans. It really genuinely would. And also it was one of the first albums, or certainly the most prominent album, I think, where you thought, well, yeah, white men can play soul music and funk music and that type of stuff. And he's, totally devotes himself and his artistic identity to succeeding in that area. As I said before, glam rock as a scene died when Mark Bolan crashed into a tree in Barnes, but it was already on the way out long before then. And as David always said, the future belongs to those who can see it coming. David was very good at seeing what was happening in the future, where the leaves were going to fall and which way the wind was blowing, and then decided that he was going to put himself at the front of that particular element of it, and therefore became a leader rather than a follower. He decided that glam rock as a scene probably was one aspect of his personality, but he'd explored that with Diamond Dogs and Ziggy Stardust and Pin-Ups and Aladdin Insane. Whereas Young Americans it still feels very much like Bowie. You can still recognise it and sort of go, yes, that's absolutely definitively him. But at the same point, it was a new direction for him, and it was an area of music that he hadn't really touched upon, apart from maybe some of the torch songs like Rock and Roll With Me and Rock and Roll Suicide, those type of big grandiose ballads that became epic explorations of sound. So the album opens with Young Americans, which was covered by The Cure in 1995 in a very different version, and then it goes up to Win. There's Fascination, Right, Somebody Up There Likes Me, Across the Universe, a cover of the Beatles because nobody's ever heard of that obscure Liverpool band. Can You Hear Me, and Fame. And it's got some great songs on there. Fame, I think, is one of the best David Bowie songs, and as I've mentioned before, Fame was built upon a riff that Carlos was playing in the midst of foot stomping when he was playing it live, but then decided that they were going to build a song out of that particular riff, which means that actually the only place you can hear, I think, an official release of foot stomping is on this here, the Soul Tour. It's amazing what gaps there were in his recorded output that were only filled after he died. These are things which, were circulating on bootleg tapes for 40, 50 years before they came out. It's pretty staggering, really. And so we have, I think, a really great album. It's also a very international album. It's called Young Americans. It's aimed at young Americans, but also it's an album that feels like he's very clearly planting his foot into the international part of it. Now, some artists get very, very defined by a nation and a flag. Oasis did with the Union Jack. Damon Albarn very clearly kind of tied himself to British identity. Other bands have tied themselves to their national identities very, very closely. David, when he released Young Americans, was very clearly saying, well, actually, I'm a citizen of the world and not just of one particular country. Clever move. Now, you've got to remember, America had a huge cultural impact starting from Elvis in the 50s all the way through to the current day. It sees itself as one of the, I think, probably the dominant cultural voice in Western civilization. You think about the number of people that live in America, 300 million, and then the number of people that proportionally have an influence upon culture, on music, film, books. There's always more Americans proportionally than there are French people, Dutch people, Australian people, and it does feel that there's a little bit of an element of America seeing itself as the world. After all, they did do that song, We Are the World, and when they did the football championships, American football, not actual football, American football, they always call it the World Championships and kind of just forget to mention that any other country in the world doesn't want to play their weird and bastardized version of rugby. Which is probably about as close to controversial about sports as I will ever get, apart from the fact that me and sports got divorced at a very early age. Young Americans is very clearly an international album, and it's also a very current album. It's not cynical because it feels very sincere. The album, David called it Plastic Soul for a reason, in so much that he was clearly kind of allying himself to what he thought was authentic and true. And when you're growing up in England in the 60s and 70s, culture came through on 7-inch singles that were imported through the ports, and the sailors would buy records and they'd listen to the records on the boats, and then they'd bring and then they'd they'd sell the records in the record shops that were next to the ports, and that's how the Beatles got all of the early American rock and roll songs before anybody else did, because Liverpool was a big port city. And so there's an international degree of culture which permeated throughout the rest of the world, and Young Americans was part of, I think, David putting a view on that and kind of saying this is what America looks like to an English kid, although he wasn't really a kid anymore. So we also have, last track on the album is Fame, and Fame got a release as a single at the time. It also got a release as a single in 1990, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you the various single releases that we had from the album. So the first single release, I think, was the title track of Young Americans. I have a spare 7-inch of this, by the way, without sleeve. If you want it, let me know, and assuming it doesn't cost too much money, I will post it to you inside the UK. So there is Young Americans, backed with Suffragette City. Now, I was the kind of kid that worked on pocket money. When I bought singles, I wasn't buying them for the A-sides. I was buying the singles for the B-sides. I was buying singles for the songs that weren't on the album that I wanted to hear. Extra stuff, because there was no point buying 2 songs I already knew. I already knew them. I already had them. I was the kind of kid that always bought the 7-inches and the 12-inches as long as there was extra stuff on it. Although there was a time, probably about 10-15 years ago, when you could pick up all of these singles for about 50p each. You could pick up Bowie albums from the 70s for like £2-3. You can't do that now. Luckily for me, that was exactly when I got into Bowie and decided I was going to go and buy all of his stuff. So Young Americans there in a 7-inch edit, backed with Suffragette City and an RCA generic one. This is Anne's song, apparently, according to what's written in chalk on the back of the single. Anne, you have fantastic taste, but I don't know who you are. One of the other singles that came from the album was Fame, here in a fantastic but also equally generic RCA sleeve. Look at that. I mean, that's the kind of thing that should go on a t-shirt. It really is. What a fantastic generic sleeve that is for RCA. This is backed with Right from the album Young Americans, even though there were several songs which had been completed and were ready to release but weren't released. There was also a single of John, I'm Only Dancing, which came out in 1979. Here it is in a slightly more generic black RCA sleeve from the time. What a shame, wasn't it, really, that didn't get a release there and then. And so Fame was, I think, the really kind of like a precursor to Sound and Vision. So if you listen to the Sound and Vision track, for example, and you listen to Fame, they've got the same kind of thing. And Fame was remixed in 1990 with a house mix, a hip hop mix, a gas mix, and a very, very long, absolutely nothing premeditated 15-minute version that was only released on CD in America. And the CD single also contains Queen Latifah's rap version, which I assure you is as terrible as you really, really think it sounds. It's really bad, and it makes Al B. Sure's contribution in the mid-90s still seem like a terrible, terrible bad move. As a general rule, throwing in guest vocalist to do a rap into a David Bowie song has never been a good idea, and it never will be. So there you go. So Fame was remixed in 1990. The remix is pretty bad, really, but can't be helped. And I always think of as Fame, the song, as a precursor to Sound and Vision. It kind of highlighted where David was going to go next in the 70s, because it's a minimal track. It's got a very minimal backing. It's got funky, it's got heavy on rhythms, on drums, on bass. It's got short clipped melody lines. It's very minimal. There's no horns in it. There's not really much in the way of backing vocals. It's got a brief backwards piano section in it, and what it sounds like is, when you listen to Sound and Vision as well, it's also almost like a remix or a rearrangement of Fame, because it's a very minimal song built upon a very small part of melodic texture, which becomes the song itself. And of course the remix in 1990, like every contemporary remix in 1990, was absolutely terrible, and we'd be better off never hearing them. I'm kind of dancing around the issue, which is there was an awful lot of material that was recorded during the Young Americans period that was never released. So quite why they put Suffragette City and Right on the B side of singles when you could have had, Who Can I Be Now, It's Gonna Be Me, After Today, for example. Those were all songs that were finished and ready, and they could have been on a B side, and they would have helped. But we got the release of those with the two Ryko releases in 1990 and 1991. So the first Ryko release, obviously the Sound and Vision box set that I bring up many, many times and will do until about 1980 and the Scary Monsters album. The Sound and Vision box set here features some unreleased songs from the period. So it featured Young Americans. It featured an alternate mix of Fascination and cover and After Today, which was recorded during the sessions but not released until 15 years later, and It's Hard to Be a Saint in the City, which was recorded apparently in 1975, although I'm not convinced it actually was recorded in 1975. I think there was some remixing and some overdubbing that took place during the station to station sessions. The albums themselves also got CD releases. Young Americans got a release on Rykodisc, and here's the EMI version, the expanded version with the extra tracks as well. Like all of these, they came in a kind of like a poster cover. Not that anyone would know. Why would you blue tack that to your wall? I mean, it's lovely, but why would you deny your CD the CD cover? But this also features the previously unreleased tracks, Who Can I Be Now, It's Gonna Be Me, and the John I'm Only Dancing single A-side, which I think was getting its first CD release at that point, although it might have been in one of those crappy RCA compilations from 1983. Young Americans, the Rykodisc and EMI version from 1990, also featured, by mistake, 3 alternate mixes of the tracks. So it had Win, Fascination and Right were taken from an alternate version of the album. So this is where it gets complicated. You might need a map. The Gouster, as mentioned previously, can't remember where I've stuck that one. Now, that's definitely not it. So the versions of those 3 songs, Win, Fascination and Right, on the 1990 and 1991 Rykodisc version of the album, actually came from the master tapes that were labelled the Gouster, and so therefore they were different mixes to the versions which had been released on vinyl in 1975. And so therefore, without really announcing it, and I think they only really realised this after this had gone to press and people went, that's a different mix of the track. They didn't really realise until later that they'd not only released 3 alternate versions of songs from Young Americans that should have been on the Gouster, they also had 2 previously unreleased songs. So there's 5 unreleased mixes or versions or songs that are on the EMI Rykodisc 1991 version of Young Americans. So well worth getting if you're a train spotter like me. That also means, by the way, that there are 3 versions of, I think, Fascination, which have come out because there's an alternate mix of Fascination, which is on the Sound and Vision box set from 1990. There's the Gouster mix of Fascination, which is on the 1991 Rykodisc release. And then there is the album version of Fascination, which is on Young Americans itself. So all the CD versions of Young Americans from 1999 onwards do not contain the Gouster mixes. The 1991 version of Young Americans featured Gouster mixes of Win, Fascination, Right, and the bonus tracks, I think, Who Can I Be Now and It's Gonna Be Me, which of course means that you don't necessarily need to buy the box set and get the Gouster on, because you've got almost all of it already if you've got the Rykodisc releases. But the Gouster is a fascinating alternate version of what the album could be. There was a 5.1 version of Young Americans that was released in 2007, and the 5.1 version came with a DVD with a 5.1 mix of the album, and it did feature Who Can I Be Now and John I'm Only Dancing, again taken from the Gouster, and a new version of It's Gonna Be Me, which hadn't been previously released, without strings on it. And I'm not sure if that version of It's Gonna Be Me is the version that's on the Gouster here. I cannot confirm that because I don't have the 5.1 mix version of Young Americans, because at that point I thought paying my mortgage was more important than buying records. The folly of youth. So there's a couple of other things which we wanted to do and we needed to talk about. So the Gouster was ready and set for release, and David went into the studio in New York in December 1974, and he recorded some extra songs. So he recorded Fame, and he recorded Across the Universe, both with John Lennon on guitar and vocals, and so therefore that meant that a couple of the songs that were going to be on the Gouster had to be bumped off. The album was given a new cover, it was resequenced, those two songs were put in, some of the songs were remixed, and so Young Americans is almost like a director's cut, and Gouster is an early rough cut version of the same album with a substantially different track listing. Having done my own creative things, I know that sometimes it isn't done until it's already in the shops, and you change your mind as you go along. But Young Americans is, in my opinion, an absolutely fantastic David Bowie album that I strongly recommend to everyone and anyone for any reason that I can possibly think of. This is, from here on in, it's 99% gold, and the 1% I will get to talking about in due course. David didn't tour Young Americans. The reason he didn't tour Young Americans was twofold. The first one is that in May 1975, David picked up his acting career, which he'd been playing with on and off previously, and he went and filmed The Man Who Fell to Earth, which I will mention in a next episode when I talk about the Station to Station album, because it was released around about the same time as the Station to Station album came out. But The Man Who Fell to Earth runs through Bowie's career from here on in like a stick of rock, and there's some fantastic and fascinating connections to be made between The Man Who Fell to Earth and his last album Black Star and his last EP No Plan and the Lazarus musical that he worked on. But The Man Who Fell to Earth was effectively a substitute for David's tour. David didn't tour for Young Americans. One of the other reasons is that he had extricated himself with the help of his assistant and office person, Corinne Schwab, who was part of the Main Man management group and had been hired by Tony DeFries. And she had realised that I think David was being ripped off left, right, and centre by the management, and he was generating a lot more money than he was ever going to see or ever likely to see. And so, therefore, David left Main Man management. However, the part of the golden handcuffs on his way out meant that until the 30th of September 1982, 16% of all of David's gross revenue, income, went to Tony DeFries, much like the way that the Stones extricated themselves from an absolutely appalling deal by ABKCO and Alan Klein. And then 50% of all the royalties of all the albums up to David Live were paid to Tony DeFries, and I think they might still be, actually. And if they're not, I'm sorry, I've only got so much memory in there. But I think it's disgraceful, frankly, that both David Bowie and the Rolling Stones were treated so abominably by their management, who failed to respect the job that they'd been tasked to do, to look after, nurture and develop their artists, and saw short-term greed over a long-term benefit. I think it's always terrible, actually, and it's always abusive, because a lot of people think that artists are stupid or not very money-minded, not very commercial, and they rip them off and they get them into these terrible deals, and then they find out that they can't get out of them. This happened to the Stone Roses as well, whereas really, actually, if they'd agreed to renegotiate at the time as opposed to money-grubbing more bits of gold out of the artist's hands, is they could have had a good, successful, long-term relationship with the artist that may very well survive until today. But the problem is, if you get greedy and you take too much too soon, you get found out and you get jettisoned along the way. And so therefore 16% of David's income up until the 30th of September 1982 went to Tony DeFries when Tony was doing absolutely nothing to generate it. It always really annoys me when people that have nothing to do with the creative process are the ones that financially benefit out of the activity, because all they really are, they're parasites sucking off other people's talents. And my number one rule is always never piss off the talent. because they have something that you don't have. People aren't buying the records because it's Tony DeFries. They're not buying the Stones records because it's Alan Klein. They're not buying Stone Roses albums because of Silvertone Records. They're buying it because of the talent and the abilities and the sound that's in the record. And if you get greedy, you get caught. And if you get caught, then you lose the golden goose. So don't piss off the talent, guys. Make sure that your job is to work successfully with them. And so therefore managers that do have the artists' best interests in mind and are able to stick to business and not ripping off the artists have long, healthy careers where they both generate enormously in terms of financially and in terms of having absolutely brilliant kind of careers and experiences. I'm thinking particularly about Paul McGuinness, who has been U2's manager up until he retired. I think the relationship that Depeche Mode have with their management team, which has been very, very stable, and I think they've been with Mute in its various forms for over 40 years now. This is where it comes in, is that if you try to rip off the artists, you will get burns. It will not last forever. And so therefore, David, and you can see this in his career path actually, the following albums that David made after Young Americans, Station to Station, Low, Heroes, Lodger, Scary Monsters. Scary Monsters was the last album that he made under the Tony DeFries deal, and it was not that commercial an album, and as soon as he was freed from the dead cold hand of that 16%, David deliberately went to make the staggeringly successful Let's Dance album, in no small way, I think, motivated by the fact that Tony DeFries wouldn't be vampirically sucking his 16% off the rest of the work, and that David would benefit and reap the rewards of what he's actually sown throughout this time. That is me talking about the Young Americans album, the Gouster album. I think we could have had a lot of great B-sides around about this period. There's a lot of alternate mixes that are circulating, as I've mentioned, officially released. There's 2 versions of Fascination. There's alternate mixes of Win and Right on the Rykodisc. There's songs which weren't on the album, so Who Can I Be Now, John I'm Only Dancing, It's Gonna Be Me, After Today. These are great songs which really should be better known. There's the Ava Cherry album, which has 6 songs written by David, which are well worth hearing, including I Am a Laser. There's also circulating tapes of a couple of unreleased songs from the period. There's a David vocal of I Am a Laser, and there is a David vocal of a track called Shilling the Rubes as well, which at one point was mooted to be a potential title for the album. And Shilling the Rubes comes from a bit of old slang, where effectively it's like, you're pocketing the money, you're fleecing the rich. There's one born every minute. Shilling the Rubes takes the same kind of approach, which is saying effectively they're suckers and we're ripping them off. So Shilling the Rubes is an important song that hardly anybody has heard. It's never been officially released. Various versions of it do circulate on the internet, and I think the recording tapes exist, I think, in a university in Philadelphia, and you can listen to them if you want to book in. But since I'm never going to Philadelphia, I have not heard those tapes, but you can hear them by appointments, in the same way that if you go to the music publisher in America, you can hear the songs that I think Bruce Springsteen wrote for a Harry Potter film. You can hear, because they have to be lodged and recorded with the music publishing company, you can hear those songs if you're prepared to do the legwork. I'm not prepared to go to Philadelphia to hear all the different versions of the songs from Young Americans. If nothing else, most of them are circulating on bootleg CDs and on YouTube as well. What I will say is Who Can I Be Now is a fantastic name for this box set. It completely sums up where David was in his career at that particular point. He was changing and evolving. He was moving away from the now dying scene of glam rock and moving into something else, something that could only be him and something that is uniquely him. Every scene has a certain finite lifespan, and the future belongs to those who hear it coming or can see it coming. David saw that the future lay in having a wider musical palette, and of course anybody that's in a band, it could be a metal band, it could be a techno band, whatever band it is, that's only one part of someone's musical identity. People generally have pretty broad musical tastes. They like lots and lots of stuff, and so therefore, if you just have a band that reflects just one part of you, you should have different sides and aspects to your sound, which of course David had all the way through his career. He was always pushing forward and exploring new things. He did glam rock, he did plastic soul, he did, you know, outright pop, funk. He did prototype grunge rock with Tin Machine, and of course he went all the way through into some weird kind of drum and bass with Earthling. It's a big world, and he wanted to see all of it before he got out alive. Young Americans is one of my favourite David Bowie albums. I think it's absolutely fantastic. I rate it very, very highly indeed. I recommend it to you. If you go, well, where should I start? Try this. This is full of fantastic songs which have aged perfectly. And that's where I'm going to wrap up. Thank you for listening to me witter on about David Bowie. I have, there's been a slight gap in the episodes because I went back to Birmingham, which is where I grew up. I spent some time with some friends. I saw a band or two. It was good to get out, but it's good to be back in, and it's good to see you again. I'll see you all again soon. Stay beautiful. Bye.